I think someone is following me.
The call came in just after 8:14 p.m. on June 21, 2015, the first official day of summer. The sun had dipped low behind the rooftops of Ashfield, Massachusetts, painting the quiet cul-de-sac in a golden glow. Children were still playing basketball in driveways. A sprinkler clicked rhythmically in the distance. And then, into that ordinary suburban evening, a woman's trembling voice broke the calm. "My name is Claire Hargrove," she said. "I think someone's following me." It wasn't a 911 emergency call. Not yet. Claire had dialed the non-emergency line for the Ashfield Police Department, embarrassed but unsettled. A 34-year-old mother of 3, she wasn't prone to paranoia. She was the kind of woman who handled carpools and PTA bake sales without breaking a sweat. But for the past 3 nights, she'd noticed the same silver sedan idling at the end of her street, headlights off. Each time she took her kids to the park or returned from the grocery store, it was there. And each time she told herself she was imagining things. Until tonight. "I pulled into my driveway and the car rolled by slowly," she said to the dispatcher, her voice trembling. "The driver just stared at me. He didn't even pretend to look away." A patrol unit was dispatched. By the time the cruiser arrived, the car was gone. The responding officer, a young rookie named Jason Kellerman, took her statement and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of forced entry. No tire tracks where the car might have lingered. He gave her the standard reassurance. "We'll keep an eye on the neighborhood." But Claire could tell from his tone he didn't believe anything was wrong. The next night the sedan was back. This time, it parked 2 houses down. Claire watched from behind her curtains as the silhouette of a man sat motionless behind the wheel, engine running. She couldn't see his face, but she felt his gaze. She called the police again. Again, by the time they arrived, the car had vanished into the night. Friends told her she was overreacting. Her husband, Eric, brushed it off too. "It's probably just a delivery driver or someone lost," he said, kissing her forehead as if logic could soothe the dread coiling in her stomach. But Claire knew better. The calls were starting again. Those heavy, silent calls where no one spoke on the other end. And 2 days later, she found something chilling. A photograph of her 3 kids, playing in the front yard, tucked beneath her windshield wiper. The image was fresh. Taken from the street. Whoever had left it wanted her to know they were watching. On June 28th, Claire walked into the Ashfield Police Department in person. She'd saved the photo in a plastic evidence bag, along with a log of the times she'd seen the car and recordings of the silent calls. "I need you to do something," she told Detective Ellen Price. "I'm scared. I don't feel safe in my own home." Price listened carefully, her brow furrowing with concern. She promised they'd increase patrol presence near her street and run a check on any vehicles matching the description. But without a license plate or direct threat, there was little they could do legally. Stalking laws in Massachusetts required more proof, a threat, a confrontation, or evidence of trespass, none of which they had. Claire left the station with a thin pamphlet titled "Personal Safety and Awareness." It might as well have been a death sentence. The following week, things escalated. The sedan began following her more aggressively. It tailed her from the grocery store, lurked near the school during pickup hours, and once even crept behind her through a car wash. Claire switched up her routes, but the car always found her. She told Eric they should consider staying with his parents for a while, but he dismissed the idea. "You're letting this get to you," he said. "They haven't done anything." But someone had done something. On July 5th, Claire returned home from an evening walk to find a small box on her doorstep. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of her, taken that same night, from somewhere behind her. Scrawled across the bottom in jagged handwriting were 4 words that made her knees buckle. "I miss you, Claire." The next morning, she called her sister sobbing. They hadn't spoken about him in nearly 6 years. Her ex-boyfriend, a volatile man named Andrew, who had once smashed her phone against a wall during an argument. He'd left the state after their breakup and was never heard from again. At least, that's what she'd believed. Now she wasn't so sure. Claire filed a formal stalking report. A detective asked if she believed Andrew might be involved. "I don't know," she said, tears streaking down her face. "But if something happens to me, it's him." By mid-July, Claire's anxiety was eating away at her sleep. She started leaving lights on all night, jumping at the sound of passing cars. Neighbors noticed her pacing the porch after dark, phone clutched in her hand. And then, on July 12th, 3 weeks after the first call, she dialed 911 for the first time. "He's outside," she whispered into the phone. "He's standing in my driveway." Officers rushed to the address. They arrived within 6 minutes, but once again the man was gone. What no one realized then, not Claire, not the officers, not even the detectives, was that they were no longer dealing with a stalker who wanted attention. They were dealing with a predator who had already decided what would happen next. And in just a few weeks, the quiet Massachusetts summer would turn into a nightmare. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. If someone left a photo of your children on your car windshield, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this chilling case. The days that followed the driveway incident were eerily quiet. Too quiet. Claire almost wished she'd hear the hum of that silver sedan again, just so she could prove to herself she hadn't imagined it all. But there was nothing. No silent calls. No photos. No shadowed figure at the edge of her property. Even the police patrol car that had been circling the neighborhood stopped showing up after a few nights. On the surface, life looked normal again. But Claire knew better. The silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like waiting, like the breath a predator takes before it pounces. She found herself scanning every grocery store aisle, every school parking lot. When a delivery truck slowed in front of her house one morning, she ducked behind the curtains, heart pounding so hard she nearly dropped her coffee mug. "You're letting this consume you," Eric told her gently one night as they lay in bed. But when she stared into the darkness outside their window, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching and planning. By the second week of July, Claire began noticing other strange things, small details that most people would overlook. A garden gate she was certain she had latched now hung slightly open. A muddy footprint near the side door where no one in the family had walked. Once, she even found her back porch light unscrewed, the bulb dangling uselessly from its socket. She showed Eric, but he insisted it was nothing. "Kids cut through yards all the time," he said. "And that light? Probably the wind." But deep down, Claire knew it wasn't the wind. And kids didn't leave Polaroids. Then, on the night of July 18th, the silence shattered. Claire had just put the kids to bed when the phone rang. No caller ID, just silence on the other end. Then, slowly, a single word crackled through the line, one that froze her blood. "Soon." She dropped the phone. The next morning she reported the call to Detective Price, who escalated the case. This was no longer a vague suspicion, it was a credible threat. Patrol presence was reinstated, and officers canvassed the neighborhood for security footage. They found one grainy clip from a gas station 3 blocks away, a man in a baseball cap fueling a silver Toyota Camry. He kept his head down, never looking toward the camera. But when Claire saw the still frame, her hands trembled. "It's him," she whispered. "I don't know how, but it's him." The police had no proof the man in the footage was connected. Still, they urged her to change her daily routine, vary her routes, avoid being alone, call 911 if she saw the sedan again. Claire followed their advice religiously. She stopped going for evening walks. She had her sister pick up the kids from summer camp. She even installed a security camera by the front door. But nothing could prepare her for what happened on the morning of July 24th. It was a Saturday, humid and bright. Claire left the house around 10 a.m. to pick up cupcakes for her youngest daughter's birthday party. Security footage later showed her pulling out of the driveway in her navy blue SUV, sunglasses on, window rolled down. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When she failed to return by noon, Eric assumed she'd been delayed at the bakery. By 1:30, he started calling her phone. No answer. By 3 p.m., he drove the route himself. No sign of the SUV. At 4:45 p.m., he called police. "My wife's missing," he said, his voice shaking. "She was supposed to be home hours ago." Detectives immediately launched a search. They retraced her route, checking gas stations, parking lots, and store security footage. At 10:12 a.m., cameras captured Claire's SUV at a stoplight less than 2 miles from the bakery. Then, nothing. No trace. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her phone pinged once more at 10:23 a.m., near a wooded stretch of Highway 14. Then it went dark. The next 48 hours blurred into a nightmare. Search teams combed roadside ditches and forested areas. Police helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers stapled missing posters to telephone poles. The media descended on Ashfield, broadcasting Claire's smiling face across every local station. For Eric and the children, the days felt endless. The house was too quiet, too empty. Every knock on the door made his heart race. Every time the phone rang, he prayed it was her. But the call never came. The investigation intensified. Police interviewed dozens of witnesses, including bakery employees, gas station clerks, and neighbors. Several reported seeing a silver sedan trailing a navy blue SUV late that morning. Others remembered a man sitting alone in a car near the highway turnout where Claire's phone last pinged. Still, there was no breakthrough. No ransom note, no messages. Nothing. Then, on July 27th, 3 days after Claire vanished, a hiker walking near the edge of Oak Ridge Forest found something wedged beneath a cluster of rocks. It was a torn scrap of fabric, streaked with blood. Tests confirmed it matched the dress Claire had been wearing that day. The discovery turned the case from a missing person investigation into something far darker. The FBI was called in. A specialized behavioral analysis unit joined the investigation, building a psychological profile of the potential suspect. Their conclusion was chilling. This was likely someone who knew Claire personally. Someone who had been watching her for a long time. Someone who wasn't just stalking her, but hunting her. Detectives revisited every name in her past. Co-workers, neighbors, family friends, and of course Andrew, the volatile ex-boyfriend she had once feared. He was living 2 states away, or so she had believed. But a subpoena of his financial records revealed a recent hotel booking in Ashfield, Massachusetts. The date? July 21st, 3 days before Claire vanished. It was the first real lead investigators had, and they weren't about to let it go. By the time investigators confirmed Andrew's hotel booking, the tone of the case shifted from desperation to urgency. This was no longer a random abduction. It was personal. And the clock, they knew, was ticking. Detectives obtained a warrant and searched Andrew's residence in New Hampshire. What they found was both chilling and damning. A set of printed Google Maps directions from his apartment to Claire's neighborhood, a half-empty gas can, and a series of journal entries describing how she had ruined his life. One entry, dated just a week before the disappearance, read simply, "She doesn't get to walk away again." Investigators now had probable cause, but not enough to arrest. There was still no physical evidence linking Andrew to Claire's disappearance, no witnesses placing him near the scene, no DNA, no recovered vehicle. But the circumstantial picture was growing darker by the hour. Meanwhile, the Alvarez family's world had begun to disintegrate. The house that had once been filled with laughter now sat in suspended animation. Claire's youngest clutched a photo of her mother everywhere she went. Her oldest stopped eating dinner. Eric barely slept, spending nights glued to his phone, calling hospitals, shelters, anyone who might have seen her. "I just need to hear her voice," he told reporters, his eyes hollow. The search itself had become a small city. Volunteers streamed in from surrounding towns, forming human chains to comb through forests and fields. Drones swept low over creeks and culverts. Dive teams scoured ponds. But despite the scale of the operation, every lead ended in the same place. Nowhere. Then, 5 days into the search, a major break. A truck driver passing through an industrial corridor near the state line reported seeing a navy blue SUV pulled into a service road on July 24th. The same day Claire vanished. The area was remote, surrounded by disused warehouses and abandoned storage units. Police descended on the site, and within hours, they found it. Claire's SUV, coated in dust, keys still in the ignition. The vehicle was a treasure trove of evidence. Forensic teams swabbed the steering wheel, door handles and trunk, collecting multiple DNA samples. They discovered partial fingerprints on the inside of the driver's side door. Fingerprints that did not match Claire or anyone in her immediate family. And in the back seat they found something that made seasoned investigators stop cold. A length of duct tape with strands of long, dark hair embedded in the adhesive. The evidence was strong but still circumstantial. The hair matched Claire's. The prints were inconclusive. And there was still no sign of Claire herself. Public pressure mounted as the case stretched into its second week. National news networks descended on Ashfield, and the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit released a chilling assessment. The suspect was likely stalking Claire for weeks, possibly even months, before the abduction. He was someone intimately familiar with her routines, someone whose life once revolved around hers. The media latched on to the obvious suspect, Andrew. His name, once just a detail in Claire's past, now splashed across headlines and talk shows. He was interviewed by police twice, each time denying involvement. "I haven't spoken to Claire in years," he insisted. "I don't even live in Massachusetts anymore." But investigators weren't buying it. A subpoena of his phone records revealed multiple pings near Claire's neighborhood in the weeks before she vanished. Surveillance footage from a rest stop just 20 miles from the service road showed a man who looked exactly like Andrew, driving a silver Toyota Camry. Still, he was careful. No witnesses, no confession, no body. The case hit a standstill until a storm gave police the clue they'd been waiting for. On August 3rd, a severe thunderstorm swept through the region, toppling power lines and trees. When emergency crews were dispatched to clear a fallen oak near an abandoned quarry, one of them spotted something glinting beneath the mud. A gold charm bracelet, caked in dirt, but unmistakable. It was Claire's, a gift from her children the Christmas before. Search teams flooded the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Within 36 hours, they found more. A torn piece of floral fabric matching the dress Claire had been wearing, and a pair of muddy footprints leading away from the quarry and into a nearby thicket. The trail stopped at a secluded cabin, one that, as property records revealed, had been rented under a fake name by none other than Andrew Miles. Inside, investigators found traces of blood on the floorboards, zip ties in a trash bin, and an empty bottle of chloroform in a corner. A forensic sweep uncovered a strand of Claire's hair in the bathroom drain. It was enough. On August 5th, 2 weeks after Claire vanished, Andrew was arrested and charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault. But even behind bars, he refused to speak. "I didn't do anything," he told reporters as he was led into court in handcuffs. "I don't know where she is." And the truth was, neither did anyone else. Despite weeks of searches, despite the mountain of evidence tying Andrew to the abduction, Claire herself remained missing. The bracelet, the fabric, the hair. They were pieces of a puzzle, but the final image was still out of reach. The case, once white-hot with leads and public outrage, began to cool. The search radius shrank. Volunteers returned to their lives. News crews packed up and left. By September, the story had slipped from national headlines, and by October, even local stations had stopped their daily coverage. But for Eric and the children, the nightmare was far from over. Every birthday, every holiday, every family milestone was haunted by a single question that no one could answer. Where was Claire? And that question, unanswered, unbearable, would define the next decade of their lives. For nearly 9 months, the disappearance of Claire Holloway lingered like an open wound on the heart of Ashfield. The town had returned to its routines, School buses still rolled down Maple Avenue. The Sunday farmers market still drew crowds. But the absence of answers gnawed at everyone. Billboards with Claire's photo still stood at every highway exit, weathered and sun-bleached. Her family still held vigils each month on the town square. And investigators, though quieter now, still met weekly to review every scrap of evidence, every anonymous tip, every dead-end lead. The case was cold, but it wasn't forgotten. And then, almost a year later, a single piece of overlooked evidence reignited everything. It started with a box. Detective Laura McKinney, now leading the task force, had ordered a full re-examination of every item collected from Claire's SUV. Most of it had been processed and cataloged months ago. A stray earring, a grocery receipt, the hair strands on the duct tape. But tucked beneath a pile of paperwork was something that had initially seemed insignificant. A smear of metallic residue scraped from the edge of the driver's side door. Back then, the lab report had been inconclusive, dismissed as industrial runoff from the service road. But with new forensic technology available, McKinney decided to run it again. This time, the results told a different story. The trace wasn't from oil or brake fluid. It was from gun oil, a type commonly used to clean a small caliber firearm. It was a small detail, but it suggested one chilling possibility. Whoever had taken Claire might have been armed that day, and that, in turn, could mean they'd used the weapon somewhere else. The discovery triggered a deeper investigation. Detectives began cross-referencing firearm purchases and registrations in the months leading up to Claire's disappearance. Hundreds of names appeared, but one stood out: Andrew Miles. A purchase logged just 2 weeks before she vanished. A .38 Smith & Wesson paid for in cash at a pawn shop 3 towns over. It was never recovered, and Andrew had never disclosed owning a gun during his previous interviews. Armed with this new information, investigators expanded their search radius from the original abduction site. They combed through firearm incidents, abandoned properties, and cold case reports. And that's when another thread emerged, one that would pull the entire investigation in a new direction. 2 months after Claire vanished, a hunter had reported finding a rusted handgun partially buried near an old drainage culvert less than a mile from Oak Ridge Forest, the same forest where her bracelet and dress fragment had been found. At the time, the weapon hadn't matched any active cases and was logged as unrelated. But now, with the ballistic data available, tests confirmed it. The weapon was Andrew's .38. It was the first piece of physical evidence directly linking him to the disappearance. Detectives were cautious but electrified. The discovery suggested that Andrew may have used the gun to threaten Claire, or worse. But it also hinted that he had returned to the scene after the abduction, possibly to dispose of evidence. That fact alone gave prosecutors the opening they needed to pursue new charges, and it meant investigators could legally obtain a more invasive search warrant. This time, they didn't just search Andrew's apartment. They tore apart every inch of it. In a locked trunk at the back of a closet, forensic teams found what they had long feared and long hoped for: Claire's driver's license, her wedding ring, and a small Polaroid photograph of her sitting on what appeared to be a wooden chair, blindfolded. The image was old and grainy, but the timestamp in the corner read July 24, 2015, the day she vanished. The photo shattered the prosecution's greatest obstacle. It was proof that Claire had been alive after the abduction, proof that Andrew had held her somewhere. With this new evidence, detectives revisited his known associates and travel history. That's when a forgotten property surfaced, a hunting cabin owned by Andrew's late uncle, nestled deep within the Berkeley woods of western Massachusetts. It had been empty for years, and according to utility records, its power had been switched off in 2014. But when a forensic drone surveyed the area, they noticed something strange: a single boarded-up window, recently reinforced from the inside. The search of the cabin would become one of the most significant operations in the case. On a frigid February morning, a convoy of police vehicles crept down the snow-covered logging road leading into Berkeley woods. The cabin was small, barely 2 rooms, but inside, it felt like a time capsule. Dust coated every surface, yet footprints crossed the floor. Empty food wrappers dated July 2015 were scattered in a corner. And then, behind a false wall panel in the bedroom, detectives found a chilling discovery: a length of rope, duct tape, a blood-stained blanket, and a woman's earring, the mate to the one recovered from Claire's SUV. DNA confirmed what everyone already knew. It was Claire's. Still, one question loomed larger than all the rest. If she had been held here, where was she now? The discovery at the cabin breathed new life into the investigation, and the media frenzy returned with a vengeance. The story dominated national headlines. New evidence in Holloway case, one read. Police close in on missing mom's abductor, said another. True crime forums exploded with theories. Some believed Andrew had killed her and buried the body. Others speculated she might still be alive, hidden away in another location. But one detail buried in the mountain of evidence would soon push the investigation toward its most significant revelation yet. In a box of old receipts recovered from the cabin, detectives found a gas station slip dated July 28, 2015, 4 days after Claire vanished. The purchase was made 250 miles north near the border of Maine. Investigators realized they had been searching in the wrong direction all along. Andrew hadn't stayed in Massachusetts. He had driven north. Forensic teams quickly mapped his possible route, focusing on secluded areas and abandoned properties along the interstate corridor. It was a painstaking process, but it began to yield results. A retired park ranger came forward, claiming he'd seen a man matching Andrew's description near an abandoned summer lodge in late July 2015. The location? Deep in the Blackwater Pines Reserve, 260 miles from Ashfield. It was the first real lead in nearly a year. The case that had once seemed cold was suddenly hot again. Police prepared a new search operation, one that they hoped would answer the question that had haunted Ashfield for nearly 12 months. And as they loaded their vehicles and mapped out their plan, one thought echoed through every investigator's mind. If Claire Holloway was ever going to be found, dead or alive, this was their last chance. The convoy left Ashfield before dawn. By the time the sun began to rise, streaking the Massachusetts sky in dull orange light, police cruisers, forensic vans, and canine units were already weaving their way deep into the thick expanse of Blackwater Pines Reserve, a vast, secluded wilderness straddling the Maine border. If Claire Holloway had been moved here, if she had died here, investigators were determined to find proof. The search was brutal. The terrain was uneven and littered with fallen logs. Humidity clung to their uniforms as officers hacked through overgrowth and marked grid sections with fluorescent tape. Drone footage mapped out the most likely search coordinates, and cadaver dogs were deployed in rotations, noses pressed low to the damp earth. For the first 2 days, the teams found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no discarded belongings, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. But on the third morning, a breakthrough came from the unlikeliest of places. A retired game warden named Thomas Ridley. Ridley had spent decades patrolling Blackwater Pines and knew the terrain better than anyone. When shown a map of Andrew's possible travel routes, he pointed to a place the team had overlooked, a long-forgotten fire service road that had been blocked off since the 1980s. "There's an old hunting lodge at the end of that path," he said. "People don't know it's there. You'd never stumble on it by accident." Detectives followed his lead. The path was barely visible, swallowed by decades of pine needles and creeping ivy. As officers forced their way through, the air grew colder, heavier. Eventually, a structure materialized through the trees. A small log cabin, rotting and sagging beneath the weight of time. Its windows were boarded, its chimney was cracked. But what unsettled everyone most was the smell. Faint, metallic, and unmistakable. Death. Inside, the cabin was a tomb frozen in time. Dust-coated furniture sat undisturbed, a single lantern hung crooked from a beam, and a thin mattress lay crumpled in one corner. Forensics moved methodically, photographing every inch. They found a rusted folding chair, its legs bolted to the floor. They found lengths of rope, still tied in loops, hanging from a support post, and near the far wall, half buried beneath layers of dirt and pine needles. They found the first undeniable proof that Claire had once been there. A gold earring, identical to the one recovered from her. It was enough to confirm the worst. She had been held captive here. Hours later, the cadaver dogs alerted near a small clearing just 50 yards behind the cabin. The ground was disturbed, subtle but fresh enough to stand out against the undisturbed soil around it. Crime scene technicians carefully excavated the site, and soon, a tangle of fabric and bone began to emerge from the earth. The remains were badly decomposed, reduced mostly to skeletal fragments and scraps of fabric. But there was no doubt this was a human burial site. And when forensic testing returned days later, the confirmation shattered what little hope remained. It was Claire Holloway. The discovery sent shockwaves through Ashfield. Candlelight vigils erupted overnight. Neighbors who had long held out hope now wept openly in front of the cameras. And for Eric and the children, the confirmation was both devastating and strangely relieving. After nearly a year of uncertainty, the search was over. Claire had been found. But the story didn't end there, because investigators were far from finished. Buried alongside Claire's remains were two additional pieces of evidence that would become pivotal to the case. A bullet fragment lodged in a tree root near the burial site, and a torn page from a spiral notebook, stained, illegible in places, but with one line clearly written. She deserved it. The bullet fragment was analyzed immediately. Ballistics experts confirmed it had been fired from a .38 caliber weapon, the same model Andrew Miles had purchased weeks before the abduction. It was the final puzzle piece prosecutors had been waiting for. Direct forensic evidence linking Andrew not just to the kidnapping, but to the murder itself. The discovery of Claire's remains transformed the legal landscape. The original charges, kidnapping and aggravated assault, were upgraded to first-degree murder. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. The defense scrambled to negotiate a plea deal, but the mountain of evidence, the duct tape, the Polaroid, the earring, the gun fragment, was insurmountable. Still, Andrew refused to cooperate. He denied everything, calling the evidence fabricated and claiming he was being framed. But one final blow would crush any lingering doubt. In March 2016, a forensic sweep of Andrew's cell in county jail turned up a handwritten letter addressed to a friend, one he never got the chance to mail. In it, he described finally being free from the woman who ruined everything and referred to the look in her eyes when she realized it was over. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but in the eyes of the jury, it was more than enough. As prosecutors prepared for trial, one fact became clear. Claire's murder was not a crime of passion. It was premeditated, planned with precision, and fueled by years of resentment. The stalking, the threatening calls, the tracking of her movements. It was all part of a long, deliberate plan to reclaim control over a woman who had chosen to move on without him. The discovery also exposed systemic failures in how Claire's early complaints were handled. Calls dismissed as paranoia. Patrols canceled too soon. Officers who brushed off her fears now faced public scrutiny. A departmental review was launched, resulting in new policies on stalking investigations statewide, a small but meaningful legacy born from unimaginable tragedy. For the Holloway family, the news brought a measure of closure but not peace. Eric described the moment he learned of Claire's death as the second she was taken from us. Her children, too young to fully understand the scope of the horror, grew up with fragments of memory and a story too painful to retell. But the town never forgot. A memorial was erected in the town square. A simple bronze plaque engraved with Claire's name and the words, "She is found, she is loved, she is remembered." And in the stillness of Blackwater Pines, where wind whispers through the trees and sunlight filters softly through the canopy, the ground that once held her body is now marked by flowers and candles left by strangers. A silent tribute to a woman whose story, though it ended in tragedy, became a rallying cry for change. The discovery of Claire Holloway's remains ended one of Massachusetts's most haunting mysteries. But as investigators would soon learn, it was only the beginning of the reckoning that would follow, a reckoning that would stretch from the courtroom to the conscience of an entire community. In the weeks following the discovery of Claire Holloway's remains, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had once been a frantic search for a missing mother of three was now a homicide case, cold, deliberate, and merciless. And with every new piece of evidence, the walls around Andrew Miles began to close in. At first, he tried to maintain the image he had built during the early days of the investigation. He stood before reporters, his hands trembling, his voice cracking, insisting that he was innocent. "I loved Claire," he said once, his eyes darting nervously. "I would never hurt her." But behind the facade, cracks were already forming. Detectives noticed his once steady composure slipping. He stopped making eye contact during interviews. His stories grew inconsistent, riddled with details that contradicted the forensic timeline. And perhaps most tellingly, he began to isolate himself, avoiding phone calls, refusing visits, and retreating into long, unsettling silences during questioning. The deeper investigators dug into Andrew's life, the more disturbing the picture became. They found that, in the weeks leading up to Claire's disappearance, he had been researching wilderness survival techniques and how to evade GPS tracking. Search histories recovered from his laptop included terms like how to hide a body in the woods and how long before remains decompose. Even more chilling, a note on his phone, created just 2 days before Claire vanished, contained a simple checklist: gloves, tape, rope, gas. But perhaps the most incriminating discovery came from a woman named Allison Porter, a former girlfriend Andrew had dated briefly after Claire left him. When detectives interviewed her, she hesitated before sharing a memory that turned the investigation on its head. "He told me once," she said, voice shaking, "that if he couldn't have Claire, no one would. He said it like a joke, but his eyes, they weren't joking." It was the kind of statement that prosecutors dream of, one that hinted at premeditation, obsession, and motive all at once. And it was far from the only troubling revelation. As they combed through Andrew's financial records, investigators discovered a series of suspicious cash withdrawals in the weeks before the abduction. The money, roughly $8,500 in total, had been funneled to a man named Luis Ortega, a former co-worker with a criminal record for breaking and entering. When questioned, Ortega admitted that Andrew had paid him to get rid of something, but claimed he backed out before learning what that something was. Even Andrew's behavior behind bars betrayed him. Fellow inmates reported that he paced his cell obsessively, muttering under his breath about unfinished business and people who should have stayed quiet. Guards noted that he spent hours scribbling in a notebook, often tearing pages out and flushing them down the toilet. One entry, salvaged from a trash bin, read, "If they hadn't found the cabin, they'd still think she ran away." As the prosecution built its case, a clear narrative began to emerge. Andrew's marriage had deteriorated into resentment and control. He had stalked and harassed Claire for months after she left him. And when he realized she had truly moved on, he meticulously planned her abduction and murder. The psychological portrait painted by the state was damning. Dr. Elaine Foster, a forensic psychologist brought in to profile Andrew, described him as a classic coercive controller. He didn't simply want Claire back, he wanted ownership of her. "For men like Andrew," she explained during a pretrial hearing, "the idea of losing control is worse than death. Murder is not about rage in the moment. It's about restoring power they believe was taken from them." With every revelation, public opinion hardened. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse during hearings, holding signs that read, "Justice for Claire," and "Stop the Cycle of Violence." Inside, the prosecution meticulously dismantled Andrew's alibis and excuses. They presented the Polaroid from Claire's SUV, the bullet fragment from the burial site, the spiral notebook page that read, "She deserved it." And then they unveiled the most haunting piece of evidence yet. Audio recordings from a hidden microphone placed in Andrew's cell during a conversation with a fellow inmate. "They think they're so smart," Andrew said, his voice low and bitter. "But they'll never prove I did it alone." The statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. It was the first time Andrew had ever hinted at someone else being involved, a claim investigators couldn't substantiate, but one that raised chilling questions. Had Ortega played a larger role than he admitted? Was someone else helping Andrew plan the crime? Or was this yet another attempt to muddy the waters and shift blame? Even as the trial approached, Andrew's behavior grew more erratic. He fired his defense attorney twice. He demanded the case be thrown out, alleging police corruption. He even tried to stage a hunger strike, refusing meals for 5 days before collapsing and being hospitalized. These theatrics did little to sway the jury pool. Instead, they painted a picture of a man unraveling under the weight of his own lies. One final piece of evidence sealed his fate. A small, blood-stained scrap of fabric recovered from his truck. DNA testing confirmed it matched Claire's. Combined with the mountain of circumstantial evidence and Andrew's own incriminating words, it was enough to leave the defense with virtually no path forward. By the time jury selection began in the fall of 2017, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Andrew Miles would be convicted. But the trial would still have its twists, some expected, others not. And in the months to come, secrets Andrew had tried desperately to keep buried would claw their way to the surface, dragging the Holloway family, the investigators, and even the town of Ashfield into one final devastating chapter. Andrew Miles was no longer the grieving ex-husband he had tried to portray. He was something far darker, a man consumed by obsession, capable of unspeakable violence, and now standing on the edge of a reckoning he could no longer escape. The day Andrew Miles was brought into the Ashfield Police Department's interrogation room, there was a palpable shift in the air. Months of meticulous investigation had led to this moment, the point where detectives would either break through his wall of denial or watch him retreat behind it forever. He walked in shackled, shoulders hunched, a faint smirk on his lips as if daring them to try. But the confidence he once wore like armor was thinning, and detectives Laura McKinney and James Ortiz were determined to tear through what remained. The room was cold, intentionally so. The table was bare, the clock above it ticking louder than usual, and the only light came from a single overhead bulb that cast long, distorted shadows across Andrew's face. He sat with his hands folded, staring at a spot on the wall, refusing to look at the detectives. They let the silence stretch, in a classic tactic. Silence is unnerving, and Andrew was no exception. Within 5 minutes, he was tapping his fingers on the table, his jaw tightening. "Andrew," Ortiz finally said, his tone measured, almost casual. "You've had a lot of time to think. This is your chance to set the record straight. Tell us what happened to Claire." Andrew let out a hollow laugh. "You already think you know, don't you? What's the point?" McKinney leaned forward, sliding a thin folder across the table. "The point," she said quietly, "is that the evidence doesn't lie, and right now it's screaming your name." Inside the folder were crime scene photos, the burial site, the fragment of bullet, the scrap of fabric stained with Claire's blood. But the most damning piece was the Polaroid taken from Claire's SUV, the one that showed a figure resembling Andrew, standing near the woods where her body was eventually found. He glanced at the photo for only a second before looking away, but McKinney caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You know," Ortiz continued, "I've been doing this job a long time, and I've seen a lot of guys in your position. Most of them keep lying until the very end. But the smart ones, they tell their story before someone else does." Andrew's jaw clenched again, but he said nothing. They switched tactics. Instead of focusing on the murder, they talked about Claire. They talked about how she had loved Andrew once, how she had believed in him, how she had begged the courts for protection when he started stalking her. They brought up the text messages, the threats disguised as apologies, the desperate promises, the angry ultimatums. And with each mention, the man sitting across from them seemed to shrink. "You want to know what I think?" McKinney asked after nearly 2 hours of silence. I think you didn't mean for it to go that far. I think you lost control. I think you were angry and scared, and when it was over, you didn't know what to do." Something shifted in Andrew's eyes. It was subtle, a softening, a flicker of something close to regret. But it was enough. McKinney pressed harder. "You loved her," she continued. "And when she left, it felt like your whole world fell apart. But it doesn't have to end like this. Help us understand. Help her family understand." The words "her family" seemed to strike a nerve. Andrew exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. "You think they want to hear anything from me?" he muttered. "You think it matters?" "It matters to them," Ortiz said gently. "And it matters to you. Because right now, this is the only part of the story you can still control." The room fell silent again. Andrew stared at the floor for a long time before speaking, his voice low and hoarse. "She wouldn't stop," he whispered. "She just wouldn't stop." "Wouldn't stop what?" McKinney asked, moving on, acting like I never existed. "She had this new life, new job, new house, new everything, and I was supposed to just disappear like I never mattered." "What happened that day, Andrew?" He rubbed his temples, his voice trembling now. "I went to talk to her. I just wanted her to listen. She told me to leave, that she was going to call the police. And something in me just snapped. I pushed her, she hit her head. She stopped moving." Ortiz leaned forward. "And the girls?" Tears welled up in Andrew's eyes. They saw too much. I didn't know what else to do." The confession was chilling in its simplicity, delivered not with anger but with a detached resignation. It was the moment detectives had been working toward for nearly 2 years, and yet it landed with a weight that felt heavier than expected. There was no dramatic outburst, no violent denial, just a man who had finally run out of lies. But even as the words left his mouth, Andrew seemed to retreat again. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he muttered. "I was supposed to fix things. I was supposed to make her see." The detectives didn't press further. They didn't need to. Every word he'd spoken was enough to seal his fate. They stood and quietly left the room, leaving Andrew alone under the harsh light. He sat motionless, staring at the wall, the enormity of what he had admitted settling around him like a shroud. Outside, McKinney and Ortiz exchanged a glance, one of exhaustion, relief, and something deeper. The case that had haunted their department for nearly 2 years was finally coming to an end. Claire Holloway's story could now be told in full. Her children could have answers, and the man who had taken everything from them would finally face justice. Yet even as Andrew's confession echoed through the halls of the station, one question lingered in the minds of investigators. How many signs had they missed? How many warnings had Claire given before her voice was silenced? And how many other stories like hers would end the same way before the system truly changed? The road to justice was far from over. But for the first time since that summer morning in 2015, it felt within reach. The trial of Andrew Miles was one of the most anticipated court cases Massachusetts had seen in over a decade. By the time proceedings began in the spring of 2017, nearly 2 years after Claire Holloway's disappearance, the story had already cemented itself in the public consciousness. A haunting tale of obsession, betrayal, and irreversible tragedy. The courthouse in Middlesex County was swarmed with reporters from across the country. Satellite trucks lined the streets, news crews broadcasted live updates, and spectators camped outside for a chance to witness the proceedings firsthand. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Claire's family filled the first 2 rows of the gallery. Her parents, siblings, and close friends, all dressed in black and clutching photographs of the woman they'd lost. At the far end of the courtroom, Andrew entered in shackles, his once neatly combed hair now graying at the temples, his face gaunt and hollow. He glanced briefly at the gallery before staring down at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. From the very first moment, prosecutors made it clear they were not seeking a story of passion or impulse. They were presenting a case of calculated, premeditated murder. Lead prosecutor Melissa Grant opened with a chilling statement. Claire Holloway did everything she could to survive. She filed for restraining orders. She changed her phone number. She tried to start a new life. But Andrew Miles refused to let her go. He stalked her, threatened her, and in the end, he took her life, and the lives of her children, in a brutal act of control and vengeance. The prosecution's case was methodical and relentless. They began by establishing a timeline that spanned months before the murder, a timeline riddled with threats, surveillance, and manipulation. Claire's co-workers testified about the anonymous flowers and notes that appeared on her car windshield. Neighbors described seeing Andrew's truck idling on her street late at night. One witness even recalled an argument overheard just days before Claire vanished, with Andrew shouting, "If I can't have you, no one will." The physical evidence was equally damning. Forensic experts took the stand to explain how the blood found in Andrew's truck matched Claire's DNA. A specialist in digital forensics walked the jury through his disturbing online searches, including phrases like, "best ways to dispose of a body," and "how long until someone is declared missing." Investigators detailed how the bullet fragment from the burial site matched a firearm Andrew had purchased months earlier, a weapon he claimed was lost in a boating accident. But it was the confession, the chilling admission during interrogation, that sealed the prosecution's case. Jurors listened in silence as detectives replayed the recording, Andrew's voice trembling as he admitted to pushing Claire during an argument, watching her fall, and panicking as the situation spiraled out of control. It was a confession devoid of remorse, delivered by a man who still saw himself as the victim of his own rage. The defense tried to fight back. Andrew's attorneys painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by mental illness and emotional instability. They argued that the death was accidental, a tragic consequence of a heated argument that escalated beyond control. They emphasized his cooperation with investigators, his alleged remorse, and his insistence that he never meant for it to happen. But their efforts were quickly overshadowed by the prosecution's rebuttal. Claire's best friend, Melissa Carter, took the stand and read aloud from text messages Claire had sent in the weeks before her death. "He's following me again. I think he's watching the kids' school. I don't feel safe. If something happens to me, it's him." The courtroom was silent. Many jurors avoided eye contact, their faces pale. It was clear that Claire had seen this coming, and no one had stopped it. The emotional climax of the trial came when Claire's mother, Margaret Holloway, took the stand during the victim impact statements. Her voice cracked with grief as she addressed the court. "My daughter begged for help. She begged for safety, and the system failed her. Now my grandchildren will grow up without a mother, and we will live the rest of our lives with a hole that can never be filled." Andrew Miles didn't just kill Claire. He destroyed an entire family. It took the jury just 8 hours of deliberation to return their verdict. Guilty on all counts, 3 charges of first-degree murder, 1 count of fetal homicide, and multiple counts of aggravated stalking and abuse. When the verdict was read, Claire's family broke down in tears, clutching each other as the weight of justice finally began to settle. Andrew, in contrast, showed no visible reaction. He stared ahead, blank and silent, as if the reality of his fate had not yet registered. At sentencing, Judge Eleanor Price addressed him directly. "Mr. Miles," she said, her voice steady and firm, "your actions were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. They were deliberate, calculated, and cruel. You robbed 3 innocent children of their future. You robbed a woman of her right to live free from fear, and you robbed a community of its sense of safety. For that, you will spend the rest of your life behind bars, without the possibility of parole." With that, Andrew Miles was led away, his final glimpse of the courtroom being the faces of the family he had shattered. He would never again walk free. The trial was over, but the echoes of his crimes would linger in Massachusetts for decades to come. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding candles and signs that read, "Justice for Claire." Reporters delivered breaking news segments as the Holloway family made a brief statement, thanking investigators, prosecutors, and the community for their unwavering support. "Justice was delayed," Claire's sister said, but it was not denied. The case of Claire Holloway became a landmark in the state's history, not just for its brutality, but for the reforms it inspired. Laws surrounding domestic violence restraining orders were strengthened. Police departments received new training on stalking cases, and Claire's story was used in countless advocacy campaigns to raise awareness about the warning signs of coercive control. But for those who knew and loved her, the verdict was only a partial victory. Justice could punish the man responsible, but it could never bring Claire back. The trial of Andrew Miles was one of the most anticipated court cases Massachusetts had seen in over a decade. By the time proceedings began in the spring of 2017, nearly 2 years after Claire Holloway's disappearance, the story had already cemented itself in the public consciousness, a haunting tale of obsession, betrayal, and irreversible tragedy. The courthouse in Middlesex County was swarmed with reporters from across the country. Satellite trucks lined the streets, news crews broadcasted live updates, and spectators camped outside for a chance to witness the proceedings firsthand. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Claire's family filled the first 2 rows of the gallery, her parents, siblings, and close friends, all dressed in black and clutching photographs of the woman they'd lost. At the far end of the courtroom, Andrew entered in shackles, his once neatly combed hair now graying at the temples, his face gaunt and hollow. He glanced briefly at the gallery before staring down at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. From the very first moment, prosecutors made it clear they were not seeking a story of passion or impulse. They were presenting a case of calculated, premeditated murder. Lead prosecutor Melissa Grant opened with a chilling statement. Claire Holloway did everything she could to survive. She filed for restraining orders. She changed her phone number. She tried to start a new life. But Andrew Miles refused to let her go. He stalked her, threatened her, and in the end he took her life, and the lives of her children, in a brutal act of control and vengeance. The prosecution's case was methodical and relentless. They began by establishing a timeline that spanned months before the murder. A timeline riddled with threats, surveillance, and manipulation. Claire's co-workers testified about the anonymous flowers and notes that appeared on her car windshield. Neighbors described seeing Andrew's truck idling on her street late at night. One witness even recalled an argument overheard just days before Claire vanished, with Andrew shouting, "If I can't have you, no one will." The physical evidence was equally damning. Forensic experts took the stand to explain how the blood found in Andrew's truck matched Claire's DNA. A specialist in digital forensics walked the jury through his disturbing online searches, including phrases like, "best ways to dispose of a body," and "how long until someone is declared missing." Investigators detailed how the bullet fragment from the burial site matched a firearm Andrew had purchased months earlier, a weapon he claimed was lost in a boating accident. But it was the confession, the chilling admission during interrogation, that sealed the prosecution's case. Jurors listened in silence as detectives replayed the recording, Andrew's voice trembling as he admitted to pushing Claire during an argument, watching her fall, and panicking as the situation spiraled out of control. It was a confession devoid of remorse, delivered by a man who still saw himself as the victim of his own rage. The defense tried to fight back. Andrew's attorneys painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by mental illness and emotional instability. They argued that the death was accidental, a tragic consequence of a heated argument that escalated beyond control. They emphasized his cooperation with investigators, his alleged remorse, and his insistence that he never meant for it to happen. But their efforts were quickly overshadowed by the prosecution's rebuttal. Claire's best friend, Melissa Carter, took the stand and read aloud from text messages Claire had sent in the weeks before her death. "He's following me again. I think he's watching the kids' school. I don't feel safe. If something happens to me, it's him." The courtroom was silent. Many jurors avoided eye contact, their faces pale. It was clear that Claire had seen this coming, and no one had stopped it. The emotional climax of the trial came when Claire's mother, Margaret Holloway, took the stand during the victim impact statements. Her voice cracked with grief as she addressed the court. My daughter begged for help, she begged for safety, and the system failed her. Now my grandchildren will grow up without a mother, and we will live the rest of our lives with a hole that can never be filled. Andrew Miles didn't just kill Claire, he destroyed an entire family. It took the jury just 8 hours of deliberation to return their verdict. Guilty on all counts. 3 charges of first-degree murder, 1 count of fetal homicide, and multiple counts of aggravated stalking and abuse. When the verdict was read, Claire's family broke down in tears, clutching each other as the weight of justice finally began to settle. Andrew, in contrast, showed no visible reaction. He stared ahead, blank and silent, as if the reality of his fate had not yet registered. At sentencing, Judge Eleanor Price addressed him directly. "Mr. Miles," she said, her voice steady and firm, "your actions were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment. They were deliberate, calculated, and cruel. You robbed 3 innocent children of their future. You robbed a woman of her right to live free from fear. And you robbed a community of its sense of safety. For that, you will spend the rest of your life behind bars, without the possibility of parole." With that, Andrew Miles was led away, his final glimpse of the courtroom being the faces of the family he had shattered. He would never again walk free. The trial was over, but the echoes of his crimes would linger in Massachusetts for decades to come. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding candles and signs that read, "Justice for Claire." Reporters delivered breaking news segments as the Holloway family made a brief statement, thanking investigators, prosecutors, and the community for their unwavering support. Justice was delayed, Claire's sister said, but it was not denied. The case of Claire Holloway became a landmark in the state's history, not just for its brutality, but for the reforms it inspired. Laws surrounding domestic violence restraining orders were strengthened. Police departments received new training on stalking cases. And Claire's story was used in countless advocacy campaigns to raise awareness about the warning signs of coercive control. But for those who knew and loved her, the verdict was only a partial victory. Justice could punish the man responsible, but it could never bring Claire back. The courtroom may have gone silent after the verdict, but the echoes of Claire Holloway's story continued to ripple far beyond those walls. Even years later, Massachusetts would not forget the summer of 2015, the case that began as a missing person investigation and ended as one of the state's most disturbing domestic homicide trials. The small town of Ashfield, once known for its tree-lined streets and quiet charm, had become a place forever associated with a tragedy that shattered its sense of security. For Claire's family, the end of the trial was not the end of their grief. "You think you'll feel closure when justice is served," her mother said in an interview months later. "But closure doesn't exist when someone you love is taken from you in such a horrific way. All you can do is try to live with the hole that's left behind." Claire's 3 children, now living with her parents, faced an especially difficult road. The oldest, just 10 at the time of her death, had testified briefly during the sentencing hearing, clinging to a stuffed bear she'd had since birth. "I miss my mom," she said softly. "I wish she could see me grow up." Counselors and therapists worked with the children for years, helping them process the trauma of losing both parents, one to violence, the other to a lifetime behind bars. The broader community struggled too. Vigils were held annually on the anniversary of Claire's death. A mural depicting her smile was painted on the side of the Ashfield Community Center, and a local women's shelter was renamed Claire's House in her memory. At town hall meetings and school assemblies, her story was retold again and again, not just as a cautionary tale but as a rallying cry for better protection, more resources, and stronger legal tools for domestic violence survivors. Law enforcement agencies across Massachusetts also took a hard look at the system's failures. Investigators admitted there had been warning signs, the stalking complaints, the restraining order violations, the repeated pleas for help that had been downplayed or overlooked. "We believed we were doing enough," said Detective Laura McKinney. "We weren't." That painful realization spurred a wave of reforms. Police departments received mandatory training on threat assessment. Victim support units were expanded. And new legislation allowed judges to impose longer and more restrictive no-contact orders in high-risk domestic violence cases. The case also reshaped public conversation around domestic abuse. Advocacy groups used Claire's story to highlight the often overlooked danger of coercive control, the pattern of manipulation, intimidation, and isolation that can escalate into violence. It wasn't just about physical abuse, they argued. It was about the psychological chains that kept victims tethered to their abusers long after the relationship ended. Despite all the changes, some wounds refused to heal. The Holloway home, once filled with the noise of children's laughter and birthday parties, stood empty for years before being sold. Neighbors still avoided walking past it. Even new owners spoke of a heaviness that lingered in the air, a reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. For those who investigated the case, the memory remained etched into their minds. "I've seen a lot of darkness in this job," Detective McKinney reflected in a later interview. "But Claire's case, it stays with you, because she did everything right. She left, she sought help, she tried to rebuild, and still, it wasn't enough. That's the part that keeps you up at night." The story also sparked broader discussions about accountability, not just for perpetrators but for society as a whole. How many warning signs do we ignore before we act? How many times do we dismiss a victim's fear as overreacting? And how often do we wait until it's too late before taking threats seriously? These were questions Massachusetts continued to wrestle with long after Andrew Miles was locked away. Today, a plaque stands in the Ashfield town square bearing Claire's name and the words she once told a friend shortly before her death. "I just want peace. I just want a life where I'm not afraid." It serves as both a tribute and a warning, a reminder that behind every statistic is a person who once had dreams, laughter, and a future that was stolen from them. For true crime enthusiasts, the Holloway case remains a haunting example of how evil can wear the mask of normalcy. Andrew Miles was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a father, a husband, a familiar face in the community. He mowed his lawn, waved at neighbors, volunteered at school events, all while harboring an obsession that would eventually destroy everything around him. It is that contrast, the ordinariness of evil, that continues to captivate and horrify audiences even years later. But for Claire's loved ones, this story is not entertainment. It's a painful, ongoing reality. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone serves as a reminder of what was lost. "We'll never stop missing her," her sister said quietly at the most recent vigil. "But we hope that by telling her story, we can save someone else." And maybe, in that hope, there is a glimmer of redemption, a chance that Claire Holloway's death was not in vain. What do you think could have been done differently to save Claire's life? And how can we as a society do better? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime cases that reveal the hidden dangers lurking in ordinary lives.